right, welcome back everybody to the hypertrophy training modules. We just went through the volume, intensity, frequency sections, and just keeping in mind like those are some of our top hierarchy priority in programming. Of course, above that, we go back to our first lecture. It was all about adherence and sustainability. That always has to come first. So we're kind of moving down our list now. We're now going to be getting into exercise selection, order, and execution. So I mentioned in our last slide when we were talking about the two things, the mistakes that I see people make are in execution and effort. In execution, I'm limited here because I can't look at your training footage and help you, so we just have to kind of go through some tenets to really look for when you are executing and see how we can make the most, and kind of had a checklist to go through for programming. But above all, we want to make sure we train hard. And that was the big takeaway from that volume, intensity, frequency, that we train hard and we do it in appropriate fashion. So the appropriate fashion is going to be how we're executing these lifts and making sure we're picking lifts that make the most of our training. So this lesson is going to be broken into two parts. So this first part, we're going to go through managing stimulus to the fatigue ratio, ensuring that you do train the muscle that you intend, the target muscle. Matching the movement to your own abilities. Why bracing, stabilizing, and control are important factors. Then also looking at strength curves, resistance profiles, and seeing how we can pair those together to make the most of this. And then in part two, we'll cover compound versus single joint lifts, lift execution, as far as like your tempo goes, your mind-muscle connection, is that even important? And then rest times between sets, and also even between reps. Then session and weekly exercise order planning and exercise variation within planning. So first off, let's talk about stimulus to fatigue. And this has been a reoccurring theme, and I hope y'all catch on to this. Like, hypertrophy training is all about creating a hypertrophy stimulus, and we talked about what this is. And to remind everyone, our main thing that we're driving here is mechanical tension. That's our main driver for a hypertrophy stimulus. Then with that stimulus, we have a bunch of fatigue that happens, right? And we need to manage that fatigue with our sleep, our nutrition, and stress management strategies. So these are our things. Now, training itself has that fatigue component. And so how do we manage that within exercise selection? So we have an exercise that's going to deliver a certain amount of tension to the muscle. And we have many exercises that can get the job done, right? So we don't have to get stuck within a certain movement pattern for hypertrophy, which is nice. It's a very, like I've said before, forgiving adaptation. You don't have to squat. You don't have to do a barbell overhead press, or you don't have to do a flat bench press. We're just simply trying to put tension on the muscle that we want. And so whatever exercise that we're picking just needs to do that. We want to maximize the stimulus to that muscle and reduce the amount of systemic fatigue that it does create. So we're trying to pick really efficient lifts that do so. And some lifts just might create a ton of fatigue and not a lot of stimulus. So we want, so an example would be like, say something that creates a very low stimulus, but a ton of fatigue. Why would you even want to do that, right? It would be completely inefficient. Our goal is to stimulate the muscle and manage fatigue, so keep fatigue very low. So movements that have that, where you have low stimulus and really high fatigue, would be like doing a quarter rep squat or a quarter rep leg press, right? You see the guy like putting on like 20 plates in the leg press, and he like barely moves the damn thing, and you're like, Jesus, why is this guy taking all the plates? I need some plates for my lift. You're barely moving anything. You're really just loading the hell out of your knees and your connective tissue, and you're taking the muscle like through this much range of motion. Is that a very good stimulus? No, not at all. It's a lot of external load, but we know we want tension throughout the full range of motion, right? And so you're not really making a great stimulus. However, with all that weight, have you ever tried to unrack a leg press that's like fully loaded? Like, Jesus, just to take it off the pins and just push it up a little bit is like so fatiguing. Or walking out like a big squat, and you're just shaking and you're like exhausted before you even start your first rep. Like, that is fatigue. So the fatigue is like way high, and you're only getting a little bit of stimulus for return. Another example of that I see a lot of bodybuilders do, and not that it's a bad thing, you just have to realize the limitations within it, is a rack pull, right? So if you have the bar set above the knee, you can pull a ton of weight. It's really about mechanics, trying to pull your hips under the bar and stack the joints effectively. You can really overload a lot, but you're not taking a lot of muscles through the full range of motion. Some people say, I'm training my lats. It's not a great lat movement at all. So for a lat movement, are you giving your lats a very good stimulus? Not really, because they're not really the active contributor in that movement. However, the systemic fatigue is huge. So you're gonna have a huge recovery bet. After you do a hard set of rack pulls, like the rest of your lifts are kind of shot for the day, right? You just don't have a lot left. So what about the other opposite end, like a really high stimulus movement that doesn't create a lot of fatigue? We want some of these in place, however, there's limitations within them. So, they'll create a lot of stimulus, but you just don't need as much to recover. An example would be like a leg extension, right? So you're only training the muscle that you want, and there's no other muscles contributing, so it won't generate a lot of fatigue. It is a lot of stimulus though for that certain muscle group, or even a bicep curl. Now, within these, you can make a good movement a bad movement, right? And you can have good stimulus for a bicep curl, but if you're all of a sudden like now swinging your back and you're bringing your arm up and you're bringing all these other muscle groups in the way, yes, you can move more load, but what does more load do for the actual bicep? It's probably already contributing as maximally as it can, but you're just moving more weight through other muscle groups taking over. So now you're generating systemic fatigue. So now you've taken a move that had a good stimulus and added more fatigue on it than you really needed to. Now, the issue with why don't we just do all isolation movements, right? If that creates the highest stimulus but generates a lot of little fatigue, is the issue is efficiency. And the time course might be generating a lot of fatigue. So if you had say your normal compound move hits 3 muscles, you're doing 3 sets, you might need isolation movements that would be maybe 9 exercises and 3 sets of all those. So now this 1 hour workout now takes you 3 hours. So now the total fatigue and time efficiency just doesn't make any sense. You still generate a lot of fatigue. So we need a component of balance to that. We need some moves that have great stimulus. A trade-off for fatigue is reasonable. Then add in other movements that can give you really good stimulus and manage fatigue when needed. So this is our next point, is a high stimulus move that also has a lot of fatigue though that is present, but are needed from an efficiency standpoint. So like a full range of motion squat or a full range of motion bench press or barbell row. Has a great stimulus effect, can hit multiple muscle groups. However, since we are hitting multiple muscle groups, there is some amount of fatigue that's going to be carried over from that. And that's an acceptable amount because we are targeting muscles that we want and we're using reasonable form in doing so. So we need to think about these things when picking movements and make sure that they flow well together. We have some good high stimulus moves that can cause some overall growth and manage time efficiency, but then add in some isolation movements or machine movements that create great stimulus but manage fatigue well. So the next points we'll cover will be how to maximize the stimulus and recognize good stimulating lift versus ones that would just generate a lot of fatigue, or ways that we can actually limit fatigue. And this is going to be looking at your resistance profiles, how we execute our sets, how we set up the movement, and our movement abilities. So the first thing, and I think the simplest thing to look at when you're coming up to an exercise is, does it train the intended muscle? Seems pretty self-explanatory. I feel like some of this stuff is common sense. And you can get real biomechanic analyst on this. And this, honestly, this could be a whole module just on its own. And I've gotten a lot of learning through like Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach, because he's excellent with lines of pull and torque at the joint and resistance profiles. And so I'm going to touch on these things, but truly, like, to really break this down would be its whole own course, which just goes a little bit beyond the context, at least for right now, what we're setting up this framework. So does it train the intended muscle group? So we're going to look at, and we want to ensure that the movement pattern aligns with the joint and muscle function that we want to move through and the muscles that actually function. So I'm not going to go give you all a whole anatomy course through these because, again, that goes beyond the scope of what we're trying to do. But I would advise you to just look up this anatomy and the anatomy charts, or there's even some good books on muscle functions during lifts and what's are contributing and what are not contributing, and kind of where muscle fibers lie. And something like that would be very beneficial, just to kind of learn those basics. And a lot of this, if you've been experienced, which you probably are if you're here, intermediate level, you kind of have a good idea of where your lat connects and attaches to, and what function and line it pulls in. But I think, and you'll see me pictured here doing a pull down. And so off this, I think it's important to video your lifts if you really want to break down your form and see how things line up. Because I know when I'm doing a lift, how I think it looks won't actually be how it looks. I'm thinking, man, I'm really nailing this. Then I look back and I'm like, my forms, I'm swinging around and my elbows are flaring out when they shouldn't be flaring out. And I'm like, oh, okay, I need to correct this. So I think videoing your lifts can really help you with seeing if just the external visual look matches well with if it's training the muscle. So what we might look here is looking at if the line of pull and push is in alignment with the target muscle fiber. So if you look on this chart, when my arms are fully extended, we see the lat fibers, which the lat fibers, they originate around the spine, and they come up and connect to the humerus. So you have fibers that run at this diagonal up to the upper arm. And so what we want is if the lat fibers are going to be in that line of pull, that's where we want the arm direction to be as well. So we can see, like in this one, the wrist to elbow to shoulder down to where the lat connects is all in line. Now if the grip was way too wide, that still might be okay for the lat, but we might be limiting range of motion, right? What if the grip was too close? If we're using one of these real narrow handles, we might actually change the line of pull and actually have a lot of bicep contribution, or even our internal rotators starting to contribute. And then we'd also look at if the joint function is not bound or compromised. And so we're trying to set up movements where you can have some free rein in your wrist. So for instance, I'm using the D handles in this, which, and sometimes if you ever do a pull down, you feel like in the bottom, my wrists are getting bound, and I'm kind of limited within that joint structure, getting compromised to generate the force that I need to execute the movement properly. And also, if your joints are getting compromised, your muscle's not going to be able to function correctly around that joint. You're also going to lose force with having to coordinate this improper joint mechanic versus trying to generate force where you intend. And so that's usually what I'm looking at as well, is so in the bottom of a pull down, and you want your elbow directly below your wrist. That gives you really good mix, because where's the line of pull, right? We're trying to pull this way down, have a pull down. So if my elbow's directly below my wrist, it makes sense that I'm gonna have the best way to give force. What if I had it angled out like this? The weight's trying to pull me up this way, and I'm trying to pull down like this. That looks wrong, doesn't it? Well, it's not going to be very efficient, right? So bring your elbow in, gives you the greatest efficiency to use your lat. Same thing with just like a bicep curl. And I can give you an example just here. Doing a bicep curl, the load is pushing down your hand, right? We have our elbow in line with our hand that comes up to our shoulder. That gives you very good joint efficiency. What if I flared my elbow out? And the line of force is still down, but my bicep's this way. It's not in line with the line of pull, right? We want it to be this way. Give you good joint efficiency. Also, when you see people doing the easy bar curl, and oh man, my elbows are killing me, or tricep extensions, right, with a skull crusher. It's look at your wrist and your elbow, and nothing's lined up. Really, for a tricep extension, we want to be like this, right? We want all the joints in line, comfortable, and that's so you don't compromise your joints. And so that will generate a lot of excess fatigue, and you're going to cause a poor stimulus. So really, just does it feel good on your joints moving through these motions? So more so on this, let's look at a squat. So this is a little bit more complex lift, but we're going to see where body position relative to the resistance force can put emphasis on different target muscles. So for whatever we're training, like in a compound move or even an isolation move, we want the target muscle to be the limiting muscle in the lift. If you're squatting and you're squatting for big quads, but your quads don't ever feel that fatigued and really like your glutes get a good pump and they like wear out, they're always getting sore squatting, is squatting the best lift for you? So we want the target muscle to be the limiting factor. So things to look at. So the joint the muscle works on is farthest from the line of resistance. So what do I mean by that? So our line of resistance is just, if it's a free weight, it's easy because it's just gravity pushing straight down. The weight's always coming straight down. So these are simple, a little bit more simple example. So with the Smith machine, the resistance is our yellow line. The force pushes you straight down. That's where you're going to travel through. Now let's look at our joints. So our blue line connects to our red line at the hip joint. How far away is that hip joint from the line of force, the yellow line? It's pretty close, right? And then how far is your knee joint from that yellow line? It's really far away. So what we know is like if we have this really long moment arm, that would be the joint that has the greatest force, that needs the greatest force production to make the lift happen. Now what if we shift your hips backwards? We bring that knee joint closer to the yellow line. We're now going to have more of a hip contribution to the lift. So now we're going to be hitting more glutes. And I'm not going to get all into the like internal and external moment arms, and that just, I think that gets really complex. I think just looking at these things, we can kind of use some common sense and where body position is to figure these out. And also looking at these, we want to see the target muscle allows for the largest range of largest range of motion at the joint we're trying to work on. So if we're trying to train the quads, we look at the knee joint, and in the bottom of this lift, do you have the smallest joint angle and is allowing the largest range of motion? So our knee joint, we're like, hamstrings touching calf, and like the knee joint's like at its smallest angle, it's also going to be able to, once you stand up with the weight, be at the largest joint angle. Then look at the hip. So at the hip, this is a pretty upright squat, right? So you don't reach a very small joint angle in the bottom phase of the squat. So you're not going to have a lot of erector or glute contribution as if you were to like squat really, really far backwards. Then of course you stand up and you gain that range of motion back. But with this type of squat setup, you would have more quad contribution. Now this could even go even farther, like with a hack squat, right? With a hack squat, your hips are directly under where you load the resistance. So you really are limited through having any type of, a lot of erector contribution, and you'll have, of course, glute contribution, but you're really taking the lower back out of it. So within this, we want to stimulate the muscle that you want and limit stimulus to other muscle groups, right? So just like I said, if you're trying to squat for your quads, but your erectors are feeling worn out and your glutes are, then you're giving stimulus to muscle groups which you don't intend to. And it's time to either modify the lift or figure out a better lift that's for you. But like I said, looking at lines of pulls and force joint angles and moment arms, like it can be a lot to really think about. And I think you don't need to be this biomechanics expert. And I think these simple tips would work for you to ask these questions and see if it's a good movement for you. And I would say, do you feel tension in the target muscle? So you should feel like kind of that tight cramp-like contraction while you're training. Think about doing, or even just right now, like flex your bicep. You know, you feel that tightness, that contraction. Do you feel that while you're training? And you might not feel it in every muscle group, but like definitely your isolation movements, usually you can feel that type of tension in the muscle. I think that might be like a signal or to just help you realize if you're using the muscle or not. What if that's not enough? Pump in the muscle. So after you do that hard set, where do you feel a pump coming? Is it to your glutes? Is it to your lower back? Do you have a lower back pump after you squat? Or do your quads get super pumped up? Well, if your quads are getting super pumped up, that's probably a good indicator that's a good movement for your quads. Then maybe you don't get a great pump, because the pump can be related to like hydration and nutrition. So you might not always be getting a great pump. That doesn't mean you're not working that same muscle. What you might realize is that muscle has like some fatigue in it. And so you might feel kind of like the muscle might feel weaker or tired after the set, or even the next day, you might have some localized muscle soreness there. which can be a good indicator like, oh, okay. You know, after you like switch a new movement, you're like, oh man, my glutes are totally sore. That's just what I wanted. Or you do something and you're like, oh, my glutes are totally sore. I didn't want that at all. And so that might be some indicators of if these are good movements and training the muscles that you intend. And so next I would say, like, does the movement match with your abilities? And you can test your mobility and movement for an exercise under 0 load. And your exercise selected should pair with this mobility range. So what I mean by that is what you want to test for, and I've made so many mistakes doing this, is that I see like, all right, I want to do an overhead press. And like, truly, like, that's my external rotation. That's like as much as I have. I can force it back and I can get right there. So that's where I should be doing my overhead press. And now I'm in this forced position. Now I can take a barbell and I can like force down. I'm putting a ton of stress on my joints and the connective tissue, but I can do it under a load and it'll force me down in this position. But what's happened when I do that? Well, I'm, for one, working outside of my movement ability. I'm working outside of my active range, and I'm loading joints and connective tissue improperly, which is going to lead to overuse injuries. And I've had this happen, guys. So what I would do is, like, if say like, all right, I need to do like an overhead press. Where is my active range? Like, before I even step into that movement, what are the position am I comfortable at? It's like, okay, I'm comfortable right here. What does that pressing angle look like? Well, I can press like up at this angle, which for me, that's about my angle of press. To get way overhead, I feel like I'm starting to have to really force it. So don't go where your body tells you not to go. It's really simple as that. I know a lot of like the rehab, prehab areas, like, oh, you need to be able to get there. And maybe so. Maybe you do want to give some better movement, if you have dysfunction, and correct these things. But we have to just work at what you have now. And that's the best thing that we're going to do. And so if this is your pressing angle, well, maybe instead of like a direct 90-degree overhead press, you're going to do like a 70-degree incline press. Same thing, like, hey, when I squat all the way down the bottom, like my heels come up. To get more range of motion, I have to like really tuck my butt hard. And it's like, well, that's just not your active range. That's not within your ability. Now we can maybe modify lifts and change some joint angles and try to get a little bit more. But overall, that should be kind of your encompassing thing. Is like just be able to move where you're comfortable to move in. Seems pretty self-explanatory, but we do this all the time. We get in a machine, it forces us and compromises us into a position we don't want to be in. So do not force the range of motion. And do not work in a range you cannot control either. So if it's something you've not used to, like the very, very bottom of an RDL, right? The hips are fully flexed, the hamstrings are lengthened. Some people lose a lot of control in that range of motion. And when you're losing control, you're not able to produce as much force. Other structures are going to have to make up for that force to try to stabilize. And that's when you can run in quickly to getting injuries or lower back injuries or pop in muscle fibers. So only work within a range where you feel like you're able to control the load. And this all comes down to working within that active range of motion with the intended muscle group. So I've seen, even on your say a lateral raise, what is the active range of motion for the lateral raise? We come up, like my delta is fully contracted. Like I cannot shorten it anymore. How would I shorten it more? I can't. How would I raise my arm up more? Well, I'd use my trap, right? So am I trying to train my trap with a lateral raise or am I trying to train my delt? Well, for me, I'm trying to train my delt. So I'm just going to come up for the range of motion of the active range of the deltoid and then come back down. I don't need to be coming way above head unless I wanted to hit my traps as well. So maybe that's what you want to do. But just work within, look at where that range of motion for that muscle group is and work within that if that's what you're trying to target. Because going beyond that range, you're going to stimulate other muscle groups and that's going to cause that greater systemic fatigue to build up. And so we're trying to manage that fatigue, right? So movement patterns that cause pain, just switch the lift or change the range of motion, right? So if you're like, oh man, John, when I do this overhead press, I come down to right here and man, I get a lot of shoulder pain. And what should I do to stop that pain? It's like, well, don't do that. It's like, well, if you get pain here, just stop there and lift in that range. It's as simple as that, guys. Like if you have pain in a movement, just don't go there in the movement. And don't try to work through pain. That's the other worst thing that you can do. Because pain will trigger changes in neurological function to try to compensate and get away from the pain. Your body doesn't want to work within that. So don't work within pain. Or if a movement's causing you pain, find a better movement that doesn't cause you pain. Remember, our number one program thing is adherence and sustainability. We want stuff that's going to be sustainable and prevent you from getting injured. So a next component to look at when we're looking at these exercises, we know if it's going to train the intended muscle group, but what's also going to be like give us a lot of good mechanical tension, right? Because that's our thing, our stimulus, right? I talked about control in our last slide. If you can't control your range of motion, but what if movements that give us good bracing stability would also give us good control? So if you're doing like a standing overhead press, right? You're standing with the barbell, you're like wobbling all over the place and you're trying to brace your core and you're like, but I'm trying to train my delts and like if I lose any more weight, I'm just gonna tip over because my core is so weak. So is that a great movement for deltoids? Probably not. Like what if you did a seated military press? So you had your torso braced against something, you could plant your scapulas in, and now that's not a limiting factor and you can brace and press that weight up and use more load. Well, that would be a better movement, right? So brace, stabilize, and control. So bracing movements will allow more stability and more force delivery. Remember, we want mechanical tension development, and so we want to create more force. In lacking stability, you're going to create a lot of fatigue and not a lot of stimulus. So another example would be this of squatting on the ground versus squatting on a Bosu ball, right? You're like, oh man, John, I need to train my stabilizer muscles. Would anyone squat on a Bosu ball? Like, it looks like you're gonna blow your fucking knee out, right? Like, our goal is to try to train our stabilizers. Like, they're gonna get enough work, I promise. We're gonna use an exercise variety to like completely have stable joints and function. We don't need to go to this excessive like functional, like when are you gonna squat on a Bosu ball in real life? So you're not gonna be able to squat a lot of weight because you're having to stabilize and coordinate that lift. Then our next stop, maybe you don't have a lot of control and bracing in a back squat yet. What about a hack squat? Well, now your torso is braced, your hips are braced against the pad, and you have your stable platform that you're working on. And so it's well braced, you're very stable control. You can probably target the intended muscle a lot more efficiently. I think this has a lot of components to within a beginner, or even someone that's very advanced. Because for one, a beginner won't have the technique to brace and stabilize well to deliver a lot of good force. And so I think they still need to learn those movement patterns. So you might have like some work on form and using technique on like a compound lift, like a back squat, but maybe you still want to have them like still generate some good force development. Maybe their other training day, they'll do like a hack squat. The other thing is an advanced lifter. Someone that's getting really, really strong to walk out at like a 500-pound squat and stabilize that. All of a sudden, like all these other muscle groups are starting to limit you outside of what you're trying to attend is maybe your quads. So moving to a stabilized movement like a hack squat might make more sense at a more advanced level. We already talked about our overhead press. Also, lifts that are more braced are more repeatable, which makes for accurate tracking of progression. And this is important for what we do. And our next lectures after these components are going to get into progressive overload, which is at a very, very high point on our list for making progress over time. But a repeatable lift, something you can do with the same form, the same setup, is going to be really good for getting efficient in that movement pattern, but also over time, being able to consistently overload it and make sure you have a good gauge of performance of where you're at. Because if you come to the next week and you're like, well, I think I squatted like this, my feet were this wide, I had the bar, I don't know, here on my back, and I put my hips back this far, and all of a sudden it's like kind of a little bit different lift than you were last week, and maybe you got weaker, maybe you got stronger, but was it really an improvement? And you won't know. So good bracing stability lifts can help you gauge that. And then like being more braced in control, being a beginner or someone that's like switching to a lift that requires a lot of stability component, you're going to have to work on that stability component, learning that movement before you're going to be able to generate enough mechanical tension in the muscle fiber to give yourself a good stimulus for growth. So there's going to be this delay. So when you switch to a new lift and it's novel, you're like, oh man, I'm like jumping up in weight so fast, like I must be growing like crazy. It's like probably not. You're probably not able to generate enough mechanical tension and force in that movement because you're still neurologically learning and getting efficient with it till you're at a proficient level. Then you start to get the hypertrophy response from from it. So that is something to keep in mind when switching from different movement patterns. And less brace movements are definitely acceptable, and they should be in place as well. Just have to ensure that the goal of directing a hypertrophy stimulus is where you intend is possible. So I'm not saying, hey, well, man, you just sold me on totally hack squatting. It's like, well, no, back squats are still a great exercise. You just have to ensure that it's the right exercise for you and what you're trying to do in goals. So how is the profile? So this can get really complex, looking at strength profiles and resistance profiles. But we can just ask a question like, where in the movement can you produce the most force? And you can look at all these strength curves and stuff and pair them, and gosh, it gets really confusing. But I think this is kind of like lays out the simple way of like, where in the movement do you feel the strongest? Where do you feel the weakest? And that has to do with actual where the muscle can function in the movement. So we looked at the length-tension relationship, right? And just for the muscle itself, not in relation to where you're lifting or anything, can produce the most force when it's kind of in the relaxed state. So if my arm's just hanging here, this is the spot where the bicep can produce the most force, right? So it can contract forcefully. If it's like really forced to lengthen, it'll lose a little bit of that force production. And then about mid-range, you still have some great force production. When it gets too short, the muscle fibers can't contract as forcefully. So so that is the strength curve for the biceps. So so that's like, in general, like the most tension you're going to produce is when that muscle is in that relaxed state, so close to it. So that's a range that you want to have consideration about. And then we want to try to see where in that movement pattern are you going to get the most tension. So if we know this bicep is strongest at this relaxed state, does the movement we're selecting create the most tension in that state? So let's think about this, like a dumbbell curl. Dumbbell's hanging at your side. How hard is it for your bicep to lift that when it's at your side? Not much, right? Like you can get it from here to here pretty easily. Then when does it get hard? About in the middle. Right, it gets hard in the middle, then you're like, have to kind of grind it up, then it kind of slows down at the top and gets a little bit harder there. So if we know the bicep's the strongest in the lengthened state, but it's really easy there, and the dumbbell doesn't challenge you because the dumbbell is at 90 degrees when it's about mid-range, does that match up with the function of the bicep? Not really. What about a preacher curl? Right, a preacher curl, your elbow's extended out now, the dumbbell's still forcing down. However, you now have the most tension when the muscle's at its lengthened state. Then as you come up, that wrist gets right above the elbow. You kind of lose tension at the top when the muscle's at its weakest state. So how does a preacher curl match up with the function of the bicep? Pretty good, right? It's better than like a standing dumbbell curl. So within this though, we want to maximize tension throughout that full range of motion. So an exercise might challenge the muscle in the shortened state, might challenge the muscle in the mid-range state, or even the lengthened state. So we can look at some examples and just get you thinking about where those different challenges arise. And I think just lifting, you can just realize like, man, when the bicep's getting short, like it gets really hard here. And so it's probably is matching well with the resistance curve, or it's really easy off the bottom. So like, does that mean that you're having a good matching? Probably not. It should be like, man, it feels hard the whole way through. And that's when you're gonna have a good matching of strength curve to resistance curve. So some examples here, like a barbell hip thrust. A barbell hip thrust challenges the glutes the most when they're fully short. So if you're doing a hip thrust, as you get to the top, it's really hard to lock out. And that's when the glutes are fully contracted. So it challenges the most in the shortened state. A dumbbell curl. So we talked about this. When you come up with a dumbbell curl, about mid-range is where you get the greatest challenge. Or how about a dumbbell pec fly? So when you're holding your dumbbells, my wrist to elbow to shoulder are all in line. There's no tension. As I come out and out farther, that dumbbell gets farther away from the pec. My moment arm is increasing. And I get the most tension when my pecs are lengthened. So it actually matches the strength curve pretty good, but not too great because it only comes about right here, then I lose some tension. So next question, does the resistance the weight or machine provides match where you are strongest in the movement? Talked about this a little bit. So does the resistance or weight challenge you throughout the full range of motion? And so we can look at free weight versus pulley-based machines versus variable resistance machines versus bands and chains. There's all types of ways to do this. So free weight's pretty self-explanatory. Wherever the free weight is, gravity's going to be pushing it down. But then that's when they came out with machines. And so they had, usually you have a set resistance, but then we had pulleys that could change, or cams that could change the resistance profile. And like with a leg curl, since the weight's not pushing straight down, it's actually an arch. So you have this kind of set resistance throughout the full range of motion. Now, the resistance is set through the full range of motion. However, the hamstring still has that length tension relationship where it can produce more force in lengthened state and less in the shortened state. So it doesn't quite match up, but it does a really good job of it. So a lot of your machines out there can have a lot better resistance profiles than what just a free weight might do. Example of this, a great example of this is like a machine lateral raise. Machine laterals that you get in, and you have like a constant resistance throughout the full range of motion for the deltoid. Like with a dumbbell, you have basically no resistance at the bottom and only a little bit at the top. So that matches up your strength and resistance curves a much better way. Kind of the next step forward was using like variable resistance machines, which we have like Prime now, which you've seen, like you could put like plates on different points, which is really confusing for most people, and they don't know what they're doing with it. But you can load a different resistance, and that resistance can drop off at different points of the movement. So you can actually match the strength profiles and resistance profiles really well. And bands and chains can do this as well. They're just appropriate applications within those. And a lot of times people use bands and chains, and they're adding tension when the muscle's already challenged really hard. So it's like adding a band onto a barbell row. Like the barbell row is already really hard to get the elbows back, and the band only makes that even harder. So that's like a terrible application for using bands on a movement. So we want to match these things the best that we can. And that's when we're looking, because this is really getting down to it, and how important is this? And it is important. I think definitely to get like higher level up, it matters. We want always to produce mechanical tension. There's a magnitude of that tension, but also a duration, which in physics you call that the impulse. So we want to expose those fibers to a certain amount of tension over time. And so if we're able to do that high amount of tension throughout a fuller range of motion, it should produce a greater hypertrophy stimulus. So we're now making our sets even more effective. So the summary of part one. We want to maximize target muscle stimulus and limit the fatigue in movements. We want to line up the force of push and pull and proper joint mechanics that target the intended muscle group. Train within your active range and your mobility limitations. Don't do movements that force you into that position. Only pick movements that allow you to move naturally. Find movements that allow you to have control and bracing throughout. It's okay to have a movement that requires a lot of bracing stability as long as you have that ability to do so. And we try to match the strength and resistance profiles of movements the best that we can, using a variety that can challenge different ranges of motion. Can definitely be the best bet for giving us a good uniform development in hypertrophy. So big picture, out of all this stuff, the simple takeaway is, do you feel the muscle contract? Do you get pumped? Does the muscle get fatigued? If you're getting those things, it's likely a good exercise. So that's my simple takeaway for you. And next we'll get into part two. We'll go through our exercise order, throughout our workouts, throughout our week, exercise variety, and also looking at some different rest times and tempos and see how that matters for hypertrophy training.